Questions? Yes, David in back.
Yeah, we should just mention the contrarian industry-funded groups like the Green Earth Society. And Bill Fraser, the scientist who covered this, went to testify in Congress. I kind of felt blindsided when he was followed by Patrick Michaels, along with Red Singer and Robert Walling, sort of a handful of industry contrarians who appear in Congress and elsewhere. And wondering if the scientists have, I know in the media we've encountered a lot of this kind of organized contrarian industry backing. I wonder, scientists, you've encountered this and what your reaction is, and does it make you want to go back into the foxhole peer-reviewed science or keep your head up above water?
James, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Is this active? Yeah. Thank you. This is sort of a moving target. I mean, if we go back to the 1990s, there was a group of people who seriously questioned whether or not there was evidence that the Earth's temperature was warming in any consistent way, and that was a fairly large group of scientists who really didn't believe the data had been adequately assembled to make that case. Or I should say in the late 80s. By the early 90s, it was quite clear to most scientists in this business that the data were now pretty consistent, and yet there was still a small group that said, well, we're not sure. By the mid-90s, the so-called attribution question had been addressed substantially by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the attribution being that the recent change is occurring in large part not as a result of natural cycles, but because of anthropogenic activities. And the small people who would have disagreed with that would say, well, yes, but I'm not sure most of it, maybe part of it, maybe a little bit. By the late 90s, that story became even clearer, and today it would be the accurate statement is new and stronger evidence indicates that most of the warming is due to human activities over the last 50 years. And now the small minority would say, well, but it isn't changing very much, and it won't make much difference. So the contrarian, if that's the term, I mean, I don't like that term actually, because I think all scientists are by nature contrarians and they're skeptics. This is our business, is to question. But if I would say, I would think that the number Usha used is not the one I would agree with. She said maybe 90%. I was at a press conference this last year with Sir John Houghton, and who chaired Working Group 1 of the IPCC, and there were about 40 people in the press in the room, and the man from Reuters said, well, he said, you're giving me just one side of this. There's that other side, too, and why aren't you talking about those views? So Sir John Houghton said it as followed. If you took 1,000 scientists who you would say worldwide knows most about this subject, and you asked the following questions: is there now clear evidence that the Earth is not only warming, but warming at a rate that is extremely unusual? And that's the important part, the rate. That's what's important about this Arctic business. It's the rate of warming. If you ask whether they think that this warming is related to an increase in carbon dioxide, you ask whether they think that the source of that carbon dioxide is anthropogenic activities, whether, therefore, our understanding of climate is good enough and our understanding of the behavior of people good enough that it's going to continue to warm in the future. He thought a bit, and he said, out of 1,000, he said maybe 5 people with credentials in this area would disagree with that. And I asked him later, I'm sorry, I misspoke. He said 10. I asked him later, how did you come up with 10? And he said, well, really, I thought it was 5. And I said, that's about what I would come up with. But he said, I doubled it to be safe. So the fundamental physics is not disagreed about. The actual data that we have before us are not open to a highly different orientation. But the real debate is about whether it will make a lot of difference and whether we as individuals, societies, governments, nations, the world, should do anything about it. That's really where the debate is.
Other panel members?
Well, what's been said is very consistent with everything I've seen. I think one of the biggest surprises for me, though, is how often I talk to people who are neither journalists nor scientists, but who think that they're up on current events, and they say, oh, but there's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and what they're saying seems to be they seem to perceive more uncertainty than I see in what I read in the press or than what I hear from my colleagues. So there seems to be this lingering uncertainty in the populace.
Usha, what do you think of that uncertainty?
Well, I think scientists have also played a role in this because there's many, especially physical scientists, who say, here's my data, the ocean is half a degree warmer or this is happening, but who are not willing to go beyond that and interpret it or talk about the causes because that isn't nailed down as well as their data is. And that sort of leaves the journalist either having to make that leap themselves or go to an environmental group to do it. But I've seen a change, and I think the IPCC has led the way in terms of having like Dr. McCarthy here, very respected leading scientists who actually have their hands in, are getting dirty doing the work, but are also willing to say this, something that means something in a policy arena. And increasingly scientists are as well. One of Sarah's colleagues is an oceanographer named Tim Barnett, who'd always been one of these very careful people. I'm not going to go beyond the data. And he had a big report in Science 2 years ago about warming in the worldwide ocean. And he was saying, boy, humans are really messing up the planet. We got to do something. And he had all these very strong quotes for the article. And I said, what happened? Why are you sound like you're the president of Greenpeace or something. And he said he was, reading over the data on his computer screen with his granddaughter on his lap, and it just hit him that these are massive changes that are potentially harming the whole planet, and he is now working much more in the policy arena. I've seen that evolution of scientists, and it usually happens to more senior scientists who I think are less worried about what their colleagues or peers will think.
Okay. Yes, in front, ma'am.
Okay, I've been paying close attention to this entire talk, and I have many questions, and I wanted to go through the different points that seem interesting to the general public. Usha pointed out that somehow global warming might contribute to an increase in disease rates. I wonder, number one, which diseases these were, and which diseases are going to go up if we have more global warming. Number two, you pointed out that Californians might have less water if the ice in the Sierra Nevadas goes down. Okay, this might be something that someone might care about. Number three, in the last talk, we learned that most of the coastline is owned by millionaires and that they have $1.4 million houses, and that these houses might become flooded, and that we might have to pay for flood insurance as taxpayers. As an average American, I might be affected by having to bail out millionaires who have expensive houses. I'm trying to figure out why the average American would need to care about global warming. If everything is true, if all the scientific research is true, we're going to have global warming. So what for the average American? If Sarah's point was that the sea level might go up by 70 meters after we're all dead. So the sea level might go up by 70 meters after we're all dead. What is the point today? How can we write an article today making this important, regardless of, assuming it's all true? It seems like all the talks have been, this is definitely true, this is definitely true, you should pay attention, this is really, really true, really, really. So what?
Okay. What used to be before inflation the $64,000 question, now it's the $1.4 million beach house question. But why don't we start with Usha and go up and down the panel?
Okay. Well, quick answers. Any disease that's spread by a temperature-dependent vector, like a mosquito, and that spreads malaria, they can only live in regions that are a certain temperature. So as temperatures warm, they'll be able to spread, and as there's more standing water. Cholera is another one that's a temperature-dependent disease, and hantavirus is very dependent on water and rain cycles. And in terms of the water in California, we don't have very big reservoirs. We don't get a lot of water, so everything that falls as rain in the spring and winter is stored as snow on the mountaintops, and that slowly melts throughout the summer as we use it. Without that, if there's more rain all year long, we don't have the reservoirs to collect it. I think, in order to get the public interested, first of all, don't talk in meters. 210 meters is 70 feet. That would fill this auditorium and more. You can look at a map of the coastline. New York would be flooded. All of South Carolina and all those $1.4 million homes would all be gone. You just have to really think creatively of ways to get people to care. One of my strategies has been to talk about people. So you talk about the pictures that you saw in Jim's presentation. You talk about Siberian subsistence hunters who are literally starving to death because there are no walruses to hunt because there's no more ice. And they just don't have the fuel or the boats to get them out to where the animals are. You just have to find ways to get people to care. You talk about Pacific Islanders who are literally having to leave their homes where they're, have had kingdoms for centuries because sea level has risen by a few inches only, but during storms that means their whole town is wiped out. So.
Others on the panel?
Yeah, I think the one thing about sea level rise that most people don't really seem to understand is that the near-term sea level rise is actually from thermal expansion of the ocean rather than melting glaciers. So as you heat the ocean up a little bit, it swells, and those rates, as was just pointed out, are actually already encroaching on a lot of small island nations throughout the world. I was just recently in Kiribati, which is in Micronesia, and it's already lost an island. And when I was at the capital, I asked everybody that I spoke with there, have you noticed any sea level rise in your lifetime? And every person had. And they pointed to another island that had gone away in their lifetimes. So I think that there is actually a story to be told within our lifetime for these events. The other thing is that there's also some thinking that some of the Antarctic, it's possible the Antarctic ice sheets could actually slip quicker. With these catastrophic destruction of ice shelves that I described earlier, there's a school of thought that if there was more decay at the leading edges of some of these glaciers, they could slip quicker into the ocean, which would then create a faster sea level rise from that. So there's a couple of comments.
Picking up on a few of Usha's remarks, disease, of course, is, as pointed out in your earlier remark, not something for which there isn't a potential public health response. And the way the IPCC has treated this is to look at areas of potential disease expansion. Now, if you look at the United States and Canada, for example, separated by this little boundary that simply looks like a line on the map, if you've crossed that boundary anywhere along the line, you know that there are very different conditions on each side of that boundary. And diseases like malaria is one of those. You will find that the public health measures that most of us benefit from in the United States of America make the likelihood that we will have malaria, a serious problem in this country, pretty close to zero. Just look at the public reaction to a few deaths from West Nile virus. In Mexico, however, or not to pick on Mexico, but in many nations of the world where that public health infrastructure doesn't exist today, what are the prospects that it will be more capable of dealing with these problems in the future? And they tend to think probably not so. Just a couple of other comments. And Greg's point about in response to your global warming, so what? It's very easy to think of winners and losers in this, but you take the case of the glaciers, the ice, the snow in California. Look at this story today in the New York Times about the Andes. This has enormous repercussions, potential repercussions for all forms of livelihood in large parts of the globe. And to the degree that you look globally at areas that will be hit hard by the kind of climate change that these scenarios project, Africa, for example, is the one that just causes you to feel enormous pain because, again, the kind of infrastructure doesn't exist there. If Kansas warms up to where you can't grow wheat in Kansas, you will not notice in Kansas that it's any more difficult to buy a loaf of bread. But because we have the infrastructure to move food around. But in many parts of Africa that doesn't exist. And just to take it back closer to home, it's, I suppose, tempting to not feel sorry for those people with $1.4 million homes, but for every one of those, there will be vastly more people who are in the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum who will be hurt by this. And just take heat waves in cities. I mean, the people who died in Chicago a few years ago by the hundreds are not people like us sitting in this room. There were people who did not have the resources to turn a switch to activate a cooling device for the space in which they're living. That's why they died. They didn't die because Chicago was hot. They died because their personal space couldn't be cooled. And this, I think, if you look across the spectrum, you see is one of the reasons that this isn't a social equity issue. It's one of the reasons that internationally, if you want to talk about what the United States should be doing, just pick on my own country right here, to show the rest of the world that we really are concerned about their lives, livelihood as well, and that to the degree that we are not, I think we look cavalier, and in this climate, I think it is just another source of temptation for people to take out their anger and aggression on the U.S. of A.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes, and I'd like to get in as many questions as possible. So if you'd ask the question in as brief a way as possible and get some quick answers and move forward. Yes, and back.
I was hoping for some clarification on a talk I saw recently I believe from the Institute of Climate and Quaternary Studies, where the scientists talked about these cycles, and one was a 100,000-year cycle, and 10,000 years within this cycle is relative calm, and then 90,000 years of these cycles are incredible ups and downs. It's basically uninhabitable in terms of storms and in terms of temperature changes. He said that we were 11,000 years into what's supposed to be a 10,000-year calm, habitable period. So the conclusion I got was that we're about to go into something that's intense cooling, actually, and intense storms, things like that.
Okay.
Do you have any comments on that?
Can someone put all the cycles in
I can try and do that. It's not a short story, but indeed it's roughly a 150,000-year cycle that has probably regulated our climate between glacial events and interglacial periods for the last couple million years. Why that started, how it's regulated are very, very important, interesting scientific questions, and we could do a whole course on that the rest of the afternoon. But the cycle you're talking about is one in which it's very asymmetrical. It takes about 10 times longer to cool the Earth to one of these glacial periods than it does to warm it. Indeed, the period we're in now, and our civilization has enjoyed for the last few thousand years, our societies have flourished because of the stable climate. So, what about the future? Yes. If you could extrapolate from the past, in the future we would be heading back into another cool period, and 150,000 years from now we might have a big block of ice here again. The changes we're talking about today, the ones that all of us were speaking about, are faster by 10, 100, 1,000 times that rate of change. It's what will happen in the next century, a rate of warming going off scale, going to warmer than the planet has been any time, at least a 500,000, maybe the last 2 million years. So we're shooting off scale into an area where these regulatory systems have never worked before. It's one of the reasons many scientists are extremely concerned about erratic climate behavior in the future. We don't know how a warmer Earth will work with the continents, the oceans, the atmosphere configured the way it is now. There's no natural experiment of that sort going back 2 million years.
Okay, other quick comments from the panel on that? I saw some of you writing. Okay, another quick, yes, Wendy.
I was just curious, I'm learning a bit about methane hydrates, which is gas encased in ice in small molecular pockets. And it's in a thin layer in the Arctic permafrost under the sea. I'm wondering if ice would melt terrestrially, would that release methane into the atmosphere? And would that be something?
You want to take that?
Well, methane hydrates exist in the permafrost and also on the seafloor, and there are a lot of uncertainties about exactly what they would do. But yeah, there is concern that if ice melts, or if the permafrost warms, or if the stability of the seafloor changes, large quantities of methane could be released into the atmosphere, and methane is a very strong greenhouse gas, so that would lead to a significant increase in the amount of greenhouse warming we're seeing.
Okay. We have time for 2 more questions. One thing I just wanted to add is we hear a lot of talk about warming, whereas really what people worry about is instability and extremes and things kind of getting out of whack. And that's something, one of the people said the so what question, it's this question of instability that really starts shaking folks. Yes?
Well, very brief comment, and that is that the position of the critics sees somebody who's been on the other end of this for a long time, has been not happening, it's benign, it's actually really good, it's not happening, and then now we can't do anything about it. It's happening. Question is, hasn't it been changes in precipitation rather than changes in temperature that's been the great eraser of civilizations? And we've got just a handful of countries that produce the entire surplus of food for 90 food importing nations, and really changes in precipitation in the breadbaskets could be the most important thing of all about climate change. Would any of you like to comment on that?
Well, I could take that and link it back to Doug's comment. You could look at scenarios for global warming and say, good news, bad news. For me, I think it kind of averages out to more good news than bad news. So I have no problem with this trajectory. And maybe some other people aren't so happy about that, but that's their problem. As Doug said, the really interesting new information that becomes robust in the last 5 to 10 years is that we're seeing a change in weather patterns. And there's some very simple ways of looking at this. You just make things warmer. Well, then what used to be the unusual cold events are now no longer so cold. What used to be the unusual warm events are now increasingly common. And you have new unusual warm events. That's if you don't change the distribution. And if the distribution is changing, the variance, it could go one way or the other. But what you see worldwide is an increased intensity, persistence, and frequency of a number of extreme events. Precipitation events are one of those. In 1989, the most intense precipitation event in Central American history, Hurricane Mitch wasn't a hurricane. There was no wind left when it swept up, that moist air mass went upslope in Honduras. How many lives? 10,000 approximately. A year later in Venezuela, 25,000 lives lost, the most intense precipitation disaster in Venezuela. And you go on, you got the same thing. Countries that are used to these things, India, all-time records, China, all-time records, Bangladesh, all-time records. A year ago, Summer Houston, the most costly precipitation disaster in U.S. history. So you're correct. The variability in precipitation, which arises as you warm the earth, you evaporate more water from the ocean, the warmer air holds more water. You have also exchanged heat, the latent heat, just as your body loses heat. When the layer of water evaporates from your skin, it goes to the air. The air is now more energized. So the precipitation comes down more episodically. You have more dense delivery of rain, which then between rain, the soil is warmer, it holds less moisture, it dries out, and then may be less able to hold moisture when it does come down. So these are very much linked, these extreme events of this sort, to the warming trend of the Earth. And you're correct, although the data are harder to reconstruct historically, there probably have been and probably will be more changes in agricultural and natural ecosystem productivity over the next few decades as a result of changes in precipitation pattern than temperature.
Other comments on that? Final question? Yes.
Just wanted to ask Mr. McCarthy whether he considers Eric the Red and his son, Philippe Erickson, as we've been talking about, real estate operators. He really put out a story calling the place Greenland, and Philippe Erickson calling Nova Scotia Vineland. Was it really that warm? Was it Greenland ever green? You said this has been warmer than for a million years. Was Greenland really green back then?
Usha mentioned a very important point, and that is if you look at any locality, you will find exceptions to the general trend. And if you look at the northern hemisphere, you find the Arctic oscillation, the Pacific Decadal oscillation, and North Atlantic oscillation, which are all pulsing with their own regulatory systems, and harmonics, as they interact, will change the climate of the Arctic. If you reconstruct the records as you best can for the Northern Hemisphere, there certainly was a period around 1000 AD where it was warmer in the southern end of Greenland. However, it was not warmer throughout the Northern Hemisphere. In fact, if you look at the Northern Hemisphere data as reconstructed from tree rings, from corals, from any evidence that can be used for proxies, you find that this must have been a rather local anomaly. Similarly with the Little Ice Age, which went the other way. this was a period which we now think was linked to an unusual period of solar variability, less emission from the sun reaching the Earth through this period of several decades, known as the Maunder minimum. Sunspots were conspicuously small and infrequent during that period, which are an index of solar activity. But you look at how that was manifested throughout the Northern Hemisphere, it didn't hit the Northern Hemisphere universally. The time it was coolest in Central Europe, when Bruegel was doing his paintings, was not the same time it was coolest over Canada. So again, these cycles of climate regulation in the Northern Hemisphere tend to redistribute and smooth some of that. Certainly, there was a warm period in southern Greenland. It's thought today to have been largely due to a change in the circulation of the Atlantic Ocean, probably related to this North Atlantic oscillation that, Eric just got there at the right time. And it didn't last forever.
They were there for 300 years.
Yeah, but then it dissipated, and it didn't extend across northern Eurasia. It's not a period we can find any evidence on the eastern or the western side of North America for a warming of that sort.
Okay. Thank you. That was a wonderful panel. Now, everybody, please stay what you are. Instead of taking a break, dragging this on and on, some people have trains to catch. What we'd like to do is have a general discussion of what went on during the day. So to facilitate that, I wonder if folks wouldn't mind scrunching towards the front, because now we're just going to run this like a give and take. And while you're busy coming forward, and I know this will take a moment, so I'll wait for you to get up and do that. Yeah. We'll have general questions on saving the ocean, the collapse of the fisheries, coastal sprawl, the Antarctic. Any of the panelists who are still in the audience will address this. Those of us who are journalists, I think we want to throw back and forth, what we think would be, where this should go for next year. We'll just open that up to a little while of that kind of thing. And then we could get out in time for some of the weekend left. So I'll give you just a minute to stretch and move down, then we'll start taking questions and throwing it around to audience members.
That's all right. Okay. Is everybody feeling cozy? It's really thinned out, so I thought it would be best just to have this be informal. We have as I said before, we have a sprinkling of panelists left in the audience, and I just want the journalists in the audience and the journalism students in the audience, if they'd like to reflect a little bit, and it's quite an august group. We still have quite a few interesting folks that could comment on this. So would anybody like to ask a question that could be open to any of the day's panelists, or perhaps some of the day's panelists would want to reflect on what they've heard today? Oh, I'm Ellen Schell, co-director of the night program. I'm sorry, not a scientist. Yes, Jonathan.
I'm curious, a lot of people have presented...
Would you like to address this to someone? And just open it up, okay.
Yeah, no.
Fine, go ahead.
It's a token question.
Okay, fine.
A number of people have spoken to particular actions that individuals can take in relation to some of these issues, such as what fish species you consume or not. And some other people addressed greater sort of policy-level regulatory issues. How do we build cities where we live? And I'm wondering if someone can talk about the tension between the idea that by just choosing what fish you eat, that sort of absolves you of other responsibilities, or that just by supporting politicians to make certain changes, sort of that's the end of an individual's responsibility, and sort of what combination of action it's going to take to change any of this.
I think it's a really good question. So the question really is, are we giving people sort of an easy way out? If we say, don't eat high off the food chain, don't eat tuna tonight, we give them the go-ahead to maybe not vote, or conversely, if they vote the way we think they should, then maybe they go ahead and eat tuna. Does anybody want to take that on? Oh, okay. Please.
You want us to come up here?
Oh, no, just go ahead. Go, yeah, you can.
Yeah, I think that one theme that came through the whole day, but it was never really directly articulated, is that of the unity of the problems that we're talking about. All of them require a fundamental change in the way human society relates to nature. And it's not going to sound like a new idea to you, but we basically need to be cognizant of the consequences of our actions in a way we never had to be before. We need an infrastructure to tell us whether the corrective measures we're taking are really working, a kind of monitoring capability. And we need, just as the situation we're in came to pass because we nibbled the world to death, we have to unnibble it now. And it's going to take many different small changes in each of our ways of life in order to bring about the change that we're all looking for. So it's really a very, very fundamental shift that we need in way of life and way of looking at life. And obviously is going to require a great deal more than scientists and socioeconomists to bring this about. I was discussing with somebody earlier the Interfaith Council on the Environment and some of their efforts to get at people through their eternal soul. That won't work for many of us, but it will work for a large segment of the human population. We need to be looking for other overarching ways of getting people to think about the way they live and accept the necessity for change, and also, as Jim pointed out, the fact that some of us are going to have to change more than others. That's a very difficult message to get across, but I think that's the fundamental challenge to the journalist community.
I don't know about, didn't Jesus eat tuna, though?
Yeah, but he doesn't drive SUVs.
That's right. So I'm not sure that's the universal. You're right. Oh, okay, there you go. Catfish. Right, he didn't eat, he did generate his own. That's right. Okay. Oh, all right. Okay, good.
Yes, and it's one of the clean forms of aquaculture.
Oh, all right. Okay. Ken, did you have something to add to that? No, okay. I'm going to throw open a question. I was really struck by the, as a journalist, and I'm speaking for the journalists now because this is a meeting for journalists, I was really struck by what Corey said about the, and Beth said about the wonderful response she'd gotten 15 years ago to the question of the insurance industry and how we're all paying for people's $1.4 million, as one of the questioners brought up. This was a story that is now 15 years old, and yet, talking to Beth, public action hasn't been taken on this, even though, as she pointed out, it was front page of the New York Times, the New Yorker, it appeared everywhere. And I wondered, what about the longevity of stories? What about journalists here? Do they feel that they can do it once and then they can't do it again? How can we actually have an effect on public policy if it's only today's news and tomorrow's fish wrap? That's my question. And does anybody have a response to that? Or some thinking on that? Or maybe Usha? Let's put her on the spot. How are we going to do that, Usha?
I think it's easy to keep covering climate change because it's evolving. There's always new science and new issues like, floods, or perhaps there's some thinking that the stream of horrendous tornadoes in Ohio might be an example of the extreme weather we'll be seeing. So there's always new ways to tell the story, and I don't know, I guess with the fisheries perhaps collapses in other areas and more disasters with...
Well, it's not all disasters. We have some good news.
Okay.
And that hasn't been, I guess that's not very popular, good news.
Well, let me have Eugene comment on that because he's the bad news boy.
I'd like to comment both on the earlier question and this one. After 9/11, I live in New York, or did, I was in Washington. I remember some very wealthy friends of mine who were talking like survivalists. Just talking about, well, we're going to get a boat, we're going to do this. And it struck me that change can happen overnight, and it happens not from above. We're not going to convince people to change. The signals they get that something's wrong with the way we're living. As those signals get stronger, people change, and they change very rapidly, almost like that iceberg disintegrating in 2 or 3 minutes. They changed in 9/11, then of course normalcy returned, and people changed back. But for a while, it was really astonishing how much people changed. There was just nothing to support it on the long term, and that was something else. But and so the problem is, I think, is that by the time the signals hit you, these are long wavelength phenomena, and it's too late. And it's been the problem on a host of environmental issues, and it's a problem of the difference in timescales between when things get bad enough that people actually react and when they should have reacted. And so, I mean, what is missing, I think, has been an effective way of representing the long-term consequences of things in the short term. And now to answer your second question, the longevity of the story. So long as the story is real, it has legs. And you can keep coming back to it. And because it gets more real. Right, there was all this question of variability on climate change earlier. And how do you distinguish normal variability from what's more interesting and maybe having to do with human-caused climate change? And I've always felt like the things that are not supposed to be normally variable, like changes in the permafrost, which is not supposed to be subject to normal variability, diseases moving up mountains into areas where people have no immunity to these diseases or adaptation to the diseases before. It's a symbol of something that is fairly new on the scene. And so that over time, those signals come out, and then the story coalesces. So I do think that all this stuff is going to happen from below and not from above, and it's not going to be engineered by anybody. But it's going to be a normal human response, which is survival. And I just hope it's in time, on not just climate change, but a host of other environmental issues as well.
Yeah, I sort of flipped the responses to yours first, which is, I just noticed when I got into the business in the 70s as an investigative reporter, it was post-Watergate, actually it was just pre, but it was the sense of outrage in the public was real. And sort of all you had to do is expose the bastards, and people took action. And some of those actions resulted in early 70s passage of the Clean Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Coastal Zone Management. Today I find that you have to, to be effective, as a journalist, I think you have to expose the bastards, but you also have to point out to on the ground or on the water solutions, practical solutions. Because there's such a cynicism built into society at this point that if you just say what's going wrong, people don't respond. If you say, here's the problem with coastal sprawl, but, interview the head of Seaside, Florida, who says, well, I built behind the dunes because that's how I saw it as a kid, and I'm trying to teach my fellow developers that long-term greed is a more effective principle than short-term greed. The solutions are out there, and some of them will be, I think the popular response, bottom-up, some of it will be quick turnaround. I think that people's sense of climate change as being in their life actually has changed relatively rapidly in the last few years. On the other hand, something like nutrient runoff. Talked to the head of sanitation in Los Angeles. She says you have to think of this as a generational change. 30 years ago, people didn't think to buckle their seatbelts, and it took a generation of going through the windshield to realize that and people smoked and didn't think they'd get cancer, and it took a generation to figure out you smoke, you end up in the cancer ward. And it's going to take a generation, but you also see the change. The Clean Water Act was, the success, and we got rid of point source pollution. And now with non-point, the fight over agriculture. Guy Steve Miller, who's running Aquarius out in Florida, he says, we used to say, think globally, act locally. So you look at the impacts on my reef, and they're local, and they're regional, and they're global. We have to act at all levels simultaneously. And I think as journalists, we also, as I say, have to be multifaceted and think that our responsibility is not only to tell the bad news, but, and Gene said, these days good news can be an exciting story because we get so little of it.
Actually, that's not what he said, but he agrees with
It's a paraphrase.
Yeah, it's okay. Yes.
I know there are a number of efforts, and I'm not familiar intimately with them, but there are a few places in the country where there's special focuses on scientists meeting with journalists to talk about presenting science, both having the scientists do a better job of presenting their information to the journalists, as well as having the journalists do a better job of reporting their science responsibly. And I know, for example, that URI has a program, I guess you all have something like that here at EU, and then there's a program that, I don't know what the title of it is, but it was spearheaded from the National Science Foundation, from Jane Kenko.
Oh, the Leopold.
Okay, yeah. So there are a few kind of high points around for kind of moving this forward. And I don't know how much the journalistic community has been focused on that particular aspect, but I think that would be a way to move that whole issue forward, how to present scientific information.
Thanks. Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment about telling the good news also, that I think that things can change in many different ways, as people are saying. Sometimes you have to have an alarm, you have to have a wake-up call that people will respond to something catastrophic that happens, and that can often mobilize people. But I think also getting people on a daily, on the level of their daily lives to care about what's going on around them. If you are bombarding them with bad news, difficult things, hard things to hear all the time, they kind of tune it out after a while, and they don't respond to it, and they kind of feel paralyzed, like, what do I do? What does it matter what I do? And I think telling the good news or telling stories where there's, you see a positive outcome for something that someone has done can really mobilize that, as we're talking about, telling stories about what's going on.
I'd like to ask a question of the journalists in the audience, something that kind of plays on what Jonathan asked before, and that is, do we too often make things anecdotal and therefore don't make the personal really political? I think that if the example that has been used for Doug and I, people who work in environmental issues, they say recycling is really just kind of a window dressing issue. The amount of energy we could actually save by recycling is not all that important in terms of global warming questions, for example, or landfill issues, because it's quite, as you know, all the complications with recycling. But to get people where they live, which is their big houses, their very large expenditures in energy, that's really, really hard and politically dangerous. So it's really good to focus on recycling because that's an apple pie issue. I wonder if we do that when we report on global warming as in general. Is this a problem that we have as journalists, that we make it anecdotal? We say you can have an impact when in fact the impact folks are having on an individual level is maybe not as substantial as we might think, whereas the real institutional provokers of global warming are not really being touched, and the institutional provokers are gleefully watching us tinker around with our recycling bins. Did anybody feel that way? Oh, Doug, respond.
I just want to reflect that in perhaps slightly more emotional tone. Because I get really irate. I mean, the line is out. Oh, you have choice. But our institutions and economy have aligned themselves in such a way that we have surprisingly little choice. We end up choosing these pathetic little things that don't really matter instead of the big thing. I mean, this is off topic, but Ellen and I were talking about obesity and fast food and all that. Now, some people say, well, just discipline what you eat. Well, if any of you have taken a 5-hour drive on a highway and your kids get hungry, tell me what there is to eat. Just fast food, and that's it. And I think in the same way, I find myself irritated that the government has obviously bought and paid for, by a whole system of expensive elections. The fix is in. And it's very hard for citizens to feel they have a direct effect, so they're ended up making these pathetic little choices. I really like what David said earlier on today when he was talking about the guys who made the fix, the post-Watergate guys and Nixon and his crew and others now. And I really like the idea of get these guys who screwed things up. I assume Jim has his hand up, so I'll stop.
Yeah, okay, Jim?
Just to weigh in a bit on this, it's clear that the picture that one paints from climate change is not all negative. However, it's also clear that there are opportunities in the future that I don't think have been adequately laid out. In other words, the current administration has taken the position that we should just be prepared to adapt. Now whether it's right, the current administration's position or not, nothing that could be done now. There is no one that has a mitigation plan in their back pocket that's been displayed anywhere that will avoid some of the harm that will occur in the future. So adaptation is the way we're going to have to go. And there's some interesting opportunities here, business opportunities. There is opportunity for innovation. You look at the innovation that came after the Clean Air Act and the sulfur emissions. I mean, anticipated cost of getting sulfur out of stack gases was far higher than it actually came to be, because suddenly there was a market, there was business. People said, I got a clever idea. Look at the CFCs, when in 1987, the Montreal Protocol, we were told, some of these compounds we can never do without. Others will be so expensive we'll have to radically change our ways of life. The automobile air conditioner will cost $1,000 more than the old ones, and by the way, the old ones can never be retrofitted. Well, innovation kicked in. Admittedly, it's a simpler problem, but look at the automobile air conditioner. It's no more expensive than it was, and for $40, your mechanic can buy the kit to retrofit the old one. It was thought not to be possible. And I guess I would like to hear more about the California story, because there's the experiment. There's the experiment in which, when energy prices went up for a whole different reason, it's in the pocketbook, people decided to try some experiments and adaptation. And this is, we see increasingly, businesses are building upon this. You see that the increasing interest in solar, increasing interest in wind, and increasingly even our big oil-producing companies, first with Amoco, BP, then with Shell, ExxonMobil now says they're getting on board. They've got a long ways to go, but I think they realize that there's business in doing the right thing. It seems we have a great experiment in California we should look at.
Well, Jim, are you saying, to speaking to journalists, then, are you saying where we should focus in on some of these alternative success stories?
Well, BP has taken out full-page ads now. National Geographic this summer, Time Magazine, back cover, saying 4 years ago we decided in our operations worldwide to adopt the Kyoto Protocol, 1990 minus, I don't know if they took 6%, 5%, whatever. And now, 4 years later, we've done it. We're 8 years ahead of schedule at no net cost to our operations worldwide. Now, that's a great story. Is that true? If it's true, that's interesting news, because clearly there's opportunity in energy efficiency that even the chemical companies are telling us about. So I haven't seen a single story on that. And
Eugene, have you seen a single story on that?
I think the biggest lie around is that it's going to cost to adapt to climate change. I think the biggest lie around is that it's going to cost to adapt to climate change. Yes, it'll affect particular communities like West Virginia coal and things like that, but adapt in terms of lessening emissions. I'm not talking about adapting. So there are two different stories here: adapting to it and adapting to lessening emissions. And case after case after case has been the same thing, where the cost of they've made money switching. But in terms of what you were saying, and also earlier, I would not discount the politics, political pressure, and consumers in terms of agents of change here. In the absence of federal regulation, you've got 17 states pursuing various strategies for putting in their own little Kyotos. And that's going to be a regulatory nightmare for I think industry is going to be begging for federal regulation just to save themselves from the states. And then secondly, all these states' attorney generals are thinking of ways to sue ExxonMobil, which is 1% of emissions, and anybody else down the road. I heard Peter Lerner in the U.S. New York Attorney General's office lay out this very scary scenario of all the different ways he could sue greenhouse emitters. And every state attorney general in the country is planning to be governor someday, so they see it as politically a good thing to do. So I wouldn't discount that. And then with consumers, 2/3 of the GNP being personal consumption, it can have an enormous impact and they can change their minds pretty rapidly, much more rapidly than you can change a building, an industrial process about what they want to buy. And capturing that choice would have a dramatic effect on emissions. So I think there are things that can be done. And they're kind of the traditional things. And stories about, as people begin to make their own judgment about how scary climate change is, and they'll do that only in response to various stories in the press about the kinds of changes that are happening and might happen, that world view will begin to make sense of them. And gee, maybe we should change the way we do things, what we buy, and how, and then look for politicians who will help. The political process will overdo it. There's no question about it. It'll happen wrong. It'll be the equivalent of climate change, homeland security thing. And it'll take 10 years to implement it. Make the problem.
Another, a 1,700-person agency.
Yeah, I was at Harvard Business School, and he gave a pretty phenomenal presentation about, like, really soup to nuts. His organization looks at basically business from a human perspective instead of humans from a business perspective. For example, they're working on this thing called a hypercar, which I think use all hydrogen power and not oil, and also even the way they design the plants to build the cars. Everything is from a physics, natural science perspective up instead of, we've got these pipes in this size, let's use them, and how can we make the plant? It's really constructed the opposite of the way most, I think, technology has been done. So if people could talk about what works, I think Time just ran an issue a month or two ago, How to Save the Planet, and Amory Lovett was one of the people that was mentioned in there. But I think in the midst of all, the dire news, people are really hoping that there's going to be some saviors coming through here saying, give us something to go to. And if you start talking more about what's worked and what's on the track to go, then people will start having a place to switch their stocks, and maybe the prices will come down on some of these things, so other regular people can afford hypercars instead of you have to be a movie star to have two prizes, or you have to make it so that it's reachable to most people.
Pat, you want a comment that you want to?
Yeah, just going to say that our discussions of what people can do, how do journalists give people something they can do, seem to vacillate between these individual decisions like recycling, which may be more window dressing than real change, and then that terrible paralysis that comes over people when they think that they personally are supposed to save the earth or change the Bush administration, both of which seem pretty formidable. But there's a sort of a more human scale level of action that I think journalists and how we place our stories really can have an impact on. And that is like thinking about the watershed issues that we were talking about in one of the earlier panels. Cities and towns constantly face decisions about land use, open space planning, zoning, the things that really determine how much an impermeable surface you have that's, screwing up the floodplain and pouring all sorts of noxious stuff into the creeks that pour into the harbor, that pour into the ocean. These things happen locally. The town where I live has faced, bitter battles over this kind of development of a watershed where, these towns are 400, 300 years old, and suddenly people decide that perhaps towns that are part of the same watershed should actually pool their scientific studies of what's happening in that watershed. It's amazing how slow some of these things can be to come about. Or how your municipality decides to dispose of its wastes, whether you send it to a clean plant or a filthy, awful plant, as in the case of my town. But there are local decisions to be made, but in a paper at the level of the Boston Globe, for example, these local stories are rarely reported. And if they are, the reporters don't put them into the context as using them as a paradigm for how change can come about. And I think this is the thing where reporters can actually frame news stories, governmental, local stories, differently in a way that can show the populace that within your unit of government, be it town or city, you actually can make a difference. And I think that can help people feel a little less powerless and less like all they're doing is tossing the newspapers.
What Pat just said connects to what I was just thinking. One of the factors I think we need to think about as environmental writers and journalists is how to personalize stories. The story of mercury pollution, for instance, doesn't get out there as much as it should because we haven't made the connections for people. Mercury is responsible for acid rain, it's responsible for the destruction of a lot of the freshwater resources in New England. If you live in the Northeast, you're getting much more mercury in the air than if you live in California. And mercury's in the food chain. Tuna, swordfish, and the other big predators. But as journalists, we don't sometimes connect all those things together for our readers, and I think that's one of the big challenges.
I mean, you can mobilize voters to act,
to vote tax overrides for schools, because the idea that better educated children makes a better community and is better for everybody down the line, that is easier to sell than the idea that it matters where you send your garbage or whether you let this particular developer put a huge asphalt parking lot in a place that's going to flood a neighborhood.
You know, I'd like to be I'm a provocateur, so I'm going to throw something out that will probably piss everyone off, but I wonder if at the same issue of the newspaper that we run a story about a 0.2 centigrade increase in deep water temperature, we run a review of the new Hummer and how luxurious that car is and how popular it is and how the price is now half of what it once was. And so all these folks, starting with movie stars, making it a very glamorous vehicle, it gets, what, a mile to the gallon? I mean, I don't know. So as all you people are being, really positive and empowering and hopeful, I think that we do understand that, for example, something as small as an SUV, which I don't think is a huge compromise for people to maybe consider not getting. I mean, I live in the suburbs. I have 2 kids. I'm a soccer mom. I do not have an SUV. My life is okay. How can we have both? Isn't there kind of a kind of intellectual dissonance there going on, that on the style page we have the Hummer, and I can say this for the New York Times, and then we have this. Anyone want to comment on that, help us with that, help us get those two things together? It's kind of scary to me that goes on. Yeah, Osha.
I think you're right, and I think this goes back to how we tell the story and the issue of recycling. I think even covering climate change is window dressing compared to the bigger issues, which are burgeoning population, habitat loss, and a country like our own, which is just gluttonous in its use of resources. And increasingly, I see at least newspapers we don't cover the homeless and poverty anymore. We cover Hummer driving. We literally had a story about people who have 3 and 4 homes and like how hard it is where you go for Christmas when you have 4 homes, which is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also just horrifying. And I just think the real message is use less, drive smaller cars, don't drive at all. And those are the kind of stories that are very hard to tell.
Are you afraid to tell those stories because they're kind of unfashionable, they're not cool, they're not hip, they're boring, they're yesterday? They're 70s, they're your father's Hummer? It's like eat your vegetable. Okay, I
have a question along the same lines, because I don't think we're just afraid to tell those stories. I think we're afraid to make those laws. Everywhere in fisheries where a law has been enacted that absolutely requires larger considerations, ecosystem-based management, people have suddenly gotten nervous and tried to figure out what that really means. It's quite, a question I have for particularly the panel on development is how many places do we have a limit on development, a plan for not growth, but a plan for sustainability? I don't think there are many. And the problem is that would require a new legal approach. It takes forever to get that into force, and it's something that probably would be very difficult to vote in. Scientists have a lot of problems, but if scientists were running the show, they would start out with a mass balance equation and say, this is how much you got, and it all has to add up at the end. And that's what the law should say.
I'm sorry.
Getting back to the rest of the speaking from a regional paper, a sister paper from Los Angeles Times, which has written not one but 2 stories touting the Hummers, but refused to run a story on SUVs polluting, refused to do a similar story on gas-electric hybrids. And I think part of the problem here is we're talking like we have unlimited space. I worked for a newspaper that had an environmental team 10 years ago. It no longer has an environmental reporter at all. Environmental stories are very, very difficult to sell as a market.
Yes.
I think that's the case with most regional newspapers.
With the exception of perhaps the LA Times and a few other places, yeah.
Which have much more resources,
yes,
but
yeah.
Do a great job.
Yeah, interesting. Jonathan?
I was just going to mention, I think it's important to remember that, at least for most journalists, you're working as part of a commercial enterprise. And that, I learned in a course years ago that newspapers, live and die by advertising. And advertising is selling real estate, they're selling cars. In fact, I think real estate and cars are the biggest parts of advertising for newspapers. So I wonder what journalists can do in that sort of medium when there is that sort of economic reality to what it takes to put the paper out.
David?
Well, I think in response to that, the sort of best case scenario you can hope for is like the Wall Street Journal, which is a purely schizophrenic enterprise in which you have good news coverage on the news section, totally ignored by the editorial page, which is kind of Neanderthal, father, son, the invisible hand of the free market. In terms of what Les says, I think the only worst situation I could imagine would be living in a society run by scientists. But further to his question about development as sort of a Californian in exile, I do see that the best development model at a state level is in California because you have a coastal commission there, and the coastal commission exists and has power because there's a sense of entitlement by the public there. And it's a question of democracy. People in California feel a sense of entitlement to public beach access. The reason you're seeing shifts like the establishment of a marine protected area in the Channel Islands relatively close to shore is because there's this messy democratic process. Fish and Wildlife screwed it up. Recreational fishermen got angry, then dive clubs and conservationists got on board. And it's all about the fact that people in California understand it's their beaches and their water. And that sense of entitlement, which also is the old style democracy before it was all bought and sold, makes, that's where we're going to be able to clean up the oceans. And
well, maybe that'd be a great story for some of us who are magazine writers. Wonderful California, the role model which we should all be following.
No, then everyone will want to move there.
But stay out. I'm sorry. Yes. No, I'm sorry. Gentlemen, yeah.
Well, I was going to say there are tremendous differences place to place around the country in how communities deal with growth, how successful they are, how unsuccessful they are. There was recently a release that I'm sure many of y'all ran, a group called Smart Growth America, ranking metropolitan regions by the amount of sprawl they had. And it wasn't just a crude assessment of how much land they were consuming. It had to do with land use mixing, it had to do with street network density. It was very sophisticated, and it's a wonderful ongoing resource for all of you who are writing about growth management. But what came out of it is that the worst places in America for sprawl were in the southeast, largely North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. And second to that, pretty much, is the northeast. And then, surprisingly, maybe in some ways not surprisingly, the west in California, and not at all surprisingly, the northwest, are doing considerably better. So the point is, and then if you look at Western Europe, they're even better in the cities. So the point is, if we could look at these comparative data and see where the bar can be set reasonably without changing our lifestyles, way of life, American dream, whatever we want to call it, we can look to other communities and find great models and how they do it, understand what policies they put in place. It's not a mystery, but it's not being covered very well. There's a group called the Elm Street Writers Group that's on the internet that Keith Snyder started. He used to write for the New York Times. It's now in Michigan. And he writes from the Michigan Land Use Institute. And it's distributed to, probably many of you get the emails. There's a lot of great writing on growth management in the country, but it's not getting mainstream very often.
Yes.
Just some comments. Before in a previous career, I spent years talking to engineers in auto companies, and they're extremely technically proficient and can do just about anything to cars and engines they please. A lot of change is dependent on economic incentives. If there is, when the price of gasoline is going to go up, or it's considered politically not so expedient to have cheap petroleum, we will be facing consumer concern. Another thing is one way to position more environmental stories is in terms of two things: quality of life type of stories and lifestyle stories. and personal health type of stories. People are really interested to know that, the mercury that they eat, fish might be affecting their kids. Or people in America, people are so uptight about their personal health. Just think about, and we're not, people complain about, well, we're not really numerically literate. That, a few people, relatively speaking, died with West Nile virus. Really, really upset a lot of people and instituted a lot of screenings. I think that not necessarily being alarmist, but pointing out, yes, there is a consequence directly to you personally in terms of your quality of life, in terms of the food that goes into your kids or the way the chemicals are getting in. Actually, those kind of stories may not be that unnatural.
Maybe one more? Yes.
I'd just like to put in a plea to journalists here that they do not denigrate all of the people who do not agree with them. There are many people who challenge whether the cost of complying with the Kyoto Agreement was worth it. And I listened to a middle ground guy, professor at MIT, who said that indeed, if we comply with Kyoto, we'll go about a third of the way towards stabilizing carbon dioxide in the world. You could do it by putting a 10-cent a pound tax on carbon fuels. That would wipe out the coal industry, and it'd be replaced by natural gas, which would not have so much carbon dioxide. But that won't get us to this meeting the Kyoto Agreement. There is a trend. I just feel that if you denigrate the people who disagree, you just get antagonisms and you don't get any more.
Then it's compounded. If it's ratified, which seems likely now with Canada proceeding to ratification, and Russia, that it is simply a first step. And of course, the second commitment period, about which discussions will begin soon, which we bring in the developing nations, that's absolutely critical. And I guess I don't know what your newspapers are saying, or I don't know collectively if there's a national position in Kyoto these days. But if there is a story, it's just the first start. And getting nations together to work on this project is an important part of the Kyoto message. The United States, First President Bush signed, Congress and Senate ratified the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which our country, 160 or some others, pledged to reduce emissions, to avoid dangerous interference with the climate. The Kyoto Protocol is just one instrument to try and do that.
Thank you very much. I think we've had it. And